England, 1587. A merchant caravan disappears without a trace while traveling through the forests of Oxfordshire. Days later, frightened villagers discover abandoned wagons, scattered goods, and signs of a violent struggle. No survivors are found. Rumors spread through market towns and parish churches that a ruthless gang of highway robbers now controls the King's Road, striking without warning and vanishing into the trees before any hue and cry can be raised. Who were these men? Why did they choose the lonely roads of Oxfordshire as their hunting ground? And how did a small band of outlaws manage to terrorize an entire county for years while the Crown's own officers struggled to stop them? To understand how this happened, we must first step back into the world these robbers inhabited, a world where the king's law was strong in the cities, and almost meaningless once a traveler passed beyond the last cottage of a village and into the dark, silent woodland beyond. 500 years ago, England was a very different country from the one we know today. The reign of the Tudor monarchs brought grand palaces, religious upheaval, and the beginnings of a powerful, centralized state, yet outside the walls of London and the great cathedral towns, the countryside remained wild, poorly mapped, and dangerously exposed. Oxfordshire sat at a crossroads of trade. Its rutted, unpaved highways connected London to the west of England, carrying wool merchants, cloth traders, cattle drovers, and religious pilgrims traveling toward shrines and market fairs. These roads were not roads in any modern sense. They were dirt tracks, often only wide enough for a single cart winding through. Dense forest, across unguarded river fords, and past isolated farmsteads with no lamps, no signposts, and no permanent watch. Travels after dark was considered suicidal by anyone with sense, yet merchants pressed on regardless because time was money, and a delayed shipment of wool or cloth could mean ruin for a struggling trading house. Law enforcement in Tudor England was not the organized, professional system we picture today. There was no police force. Instead, the burden of keeping order fell upon a patchwork of unpaid or poorly paid officials, constables chosen from among ordinary, villagers who often had neither the training nor the courage to confront armed men, sheriffs appointed by the Crown who were responsible for entire counties, but possessed only a handful of men to cover hundreds of square miles, and justices of the peace who could issue warrants and hold hearings, but had no standing force to actually carry out an arrest. The ancient system of the hue and cry, in which a victim or witness was supposed to raise the alarm and every able-bodied man in earshot was legally obligated to join the pursuit, worked reasonably well in a crowded town square but collapsed entirely in open countryside, where the nearest neighbor might live a mile away and the robbers had already melted into the tree line before anyone even heard the scream. This vacuum of authority created the perfect conditions for organized robbery to flourish. A determined and disciplined band of men, armed with swords, daggers, and the occasional matchlock pistol, mounted on fast horses and intimately familiar with the forest paths, footbridges, and hidden hollows of their home territory, held an overwhelming advantage over any traveler, however wealthy or well-guarded. Trade along the Oxfordshire roads was booming in this period, driven by the wool and cloth industries that formed the backbone of the English economy, and this prosperity was precisely what drew the robbers to these particular routes. Merchants carried coin to pay for goods at distant markets, they carried finished cloth and raw wool bound for sale, and they often carried these valuables with only one or two hired guards, men who were paid a modest wage, and had little personal incentive to die defending someone else's property. Pilgrims, too, made attractive targets. Though the great age of pilgrimage was fading under the pressures of religious reformation, travelers still moved along these roads toward holy sites and market towns, often carrying what savings they had for lodging and offerings, and traveling in small, poorly defended groups that made easy prey for a gang willing to use violence. It was against this backdrop, in the deep woodland tracks that stretched along the road between Oxford and the western market towns, that the first confirmed robbery attributed to what would become known as the Oxfordshire gang took place. A cloth merchant named Nicholas Fenwick, traveling with two servants and a cart loaded with bolts of finished wool cloth bound for sale at a distant fair, was stopped at a narrow bend in the road where the forest pressed close on both sides. Armed men emerged from the trees before Fenwick's party had any chance to turn back or defend themselves. Within minutes, the servants were beaten and bound. The cart was stripped of its cargo, and the robbers vanished into the woodland as quickly as they had appeared, leaving no trail that local villagers could follow. Fenwick survived to tell his story, but the damage to his business and to the sense of safety along that stretch of road was done. Word of the attack spread through neighboring villages within days, carried by frightened travelers and gossiping tradesmen, and for the first time, local people began to speak of an organized gang rather than a lone, desperate thief. This was only the beginning. The gang that emerged from the shadows of the Oxfordshire woodland was not a loose collection of opportunistic criminals, but something far more calculated. And to understand how they managed to terrorize an entire region for so long, we must look closely at who they were, how they operated, and why the ordinary tools of Tudor law enforcement proved so hopelessly inadequate against them. At the center of the gang stood a man local records and later folk memory would come to know by the name Henry Ashcombe, though among his own men, and in the whispered fear of the villagers, he was called Black Hal, a nickname earned either for his dark hair and beard or for the darkness of his reputation. Accounts differ. Ashcombe was said to have once worked as a drover, moving cattle and sheep along the very roads he would later plague, giving him an unmatched knowledge of every track, ford, and hidden clearing in the region. This background gave him a crucial advantage, for he understood exactly where merchants would be most vulnerable, which bends in the road offered cover for ambush, and which routes local officials rarely bothered to patrol. Beneath Ashcombe stood a smaller circle of trusted men who formed the core of the operation. Chief among them was a former soldier named Thomas Reed, a man hardened by campaign service who brought military discipline to what might otherwise have been a chaotic band of thieves. Reed is credited with organizing the gang's approach to ambush, insisting on scouting a target in advance, positioning men at both ends of a chosen stretch of road to prevent escape in either direction, and establishing signals, whistles, and bird calls to coordinate the attack without alerting the victims until it was too late. Around Ashcombe and Reed gathered perhaps 8 to 12 additional men at the gang's height, a number that historians studying similar bands of the period consider typical for an organized highway robbery operation, large enough to overwhelm armed guards, but small enough to move quickly and remain difficult to trace. The gang's weapons reflected both their ambitions and the realities of the age. Swords and daggers were standard, cheap to acquire and effective at close range, while a small number of the gang, likely those with military experience like Reed, carried early matchlock pistols, weapons that were unreliable and slow to reload but devastating in the shock of a surprise attack, and whose mere presence was often enough to end resistance before it began. Horses were essential to the gang's success, not merely for the robbery itself, but for the swift escape afterward, and the gang is believed to have kept several horses hidden at outlying farms, allowing them to switch mounts and throw off any pursuit that did materialize. Their hideouts were chosen with the same careful attention to terrain that marked every aspect of their operation. Deep within the wooded tracts of Oxfordshire, the gang maintained what local tradition describes as forest camps, temporary shelters built in dense thickets or natural hollows, difficult to find, unless one already knew the paths leading to them, and easily abandoned and rebuilt elsewhere if authorities ever came close. These camps served as both living quarters and storage for stolen goods awaiting sale, and their impermanence was itself a form of protection, since a search party arriving at a rumored campsite would often find nothing but cold ashes and trampled grass. Just as important as their physical hideouts was the gang's network of local informants, ordinary villagers, innkeepers, and stable hands, who, whether out of fear, greed, or genuine sympathy for men seen by some as standing against a distant and uncaring crown, provided the gang with crucial intelligence. An innkeeper might casually mention to a stranger which merchants had passed through with heavy purses. A stable boy might report which travelers had hired extra guards and were therefore worth avoiding. And a farmer might allow the gang to use his barn or pasture without asking questions, all in exchange for a share of the proceeds or simple protection from the gang's retaliation. This web of local cooperation, built on the genuine poverty and precarious existence of many rural Tudor households, made the gang's operations vastly more effective than those of any single bandit acting alone, and it made the task of the authorities correspondingly harder, since every village along the road potentially harbored someone, loyal to the outlaws rather than to the sheriff. The gang's victims fell into recognizable categories that reflected the traffic of the roads themselves. Merchants remained the primary target, valued for the coin and goods they carried, but pilgrims traveling in small groups were also struck when the opportunity presented itself, their modest savings and lack of armed protection making them easy, if less profitable, prey. Royal messengers, carrying official correspondence and sometimes funds between London and administrative centers in the West, represented a riskier but potentially lucrative target, and at least one documented case suggests the gang did not hesitate to strike even at riders known to be on the king's business, a bold and dangerous choice that would eventually help bring the full weight of royal authority down upon them. Noble travelers, when they passed through with insufficient guard, were targeted as well, their fine clothing, jewelry, and personal effects fetching high prices when sold onward. A typical robbery followed a pattern refined through repetition. Scouts, often local informants or gang members disguised as ordinary travelers, would identify a promising target well before it reached the danger zone, noting the number of guards, the visible wealth of the cargo, and the timing of the journey. The gang would then position itself at a chosen ambush point, a narrow bend, a river crossing, or a stretch where the road passed through particularly dense woodland, with men concealed on both sides to block escape in either direction. When the target arrived, the attack came suddenly and with overwhelming force, riders bursting from the tree line, weapons drawn, shouting to create confusion and fear before any organized resistance could form. Guards who resisted were cut down or beaten into submission, while those who surrendered quickly were often simply bound and left, a calculated mercy that served the gang's interests by reducing the severity of the crimes they could be charged with and by discouraging witnesses from actively fighting back, since word spread that surrender meant survival while resistance meant death. This is a crucial reason why so few victims ever escaped to raise a timely alarm. The ambush points were deliberately chosen for their isolation, meaning that even a victim who managed to flee had miles to travel before reaching help, by which time the gang had already scattered into the forest, along paths no outsider could follow. The stolen goods themselves required a final, crucial link to be turned into usable wealth, and this role fell to what contemporary records call a fence, a receiver of stolen property who could disguise its origin and move it into legitimate trade channels. Local tradition and surviving court records point to a dealer known as Old Marlowe, based in a market town along the gang's operating territory, who purchased stolen cloth, wool, and coin at a steep discount and then resold or laundered these goods through his own legitimate trading connections, taking a substantial cut for the risk involved. Without a reliable fence, the gang's stolen goods would have been worthless, since a bolt of cloth bearing a merchant's known mark could not simply be sold openly at the next market fair without inviting immediate suspicion. It was this entire structure, the disciplined leadership, the local intelligence network, the careful choice of ambush points, and the reliable outlet for stolen goods that transformed what might have been a handful of isolated crimes into a sustained criminal enterprise capable of operating for years. As robbery followed, robbery along the Oxfordshire roads, and as merchants began to speak openly of avoiding certain stretches of highway altogether, the gang's reputation grew from local rumor into something approaching regional legend. The name of Black Hal whispered in taverns and market squares alike, feared by travelers and in some quarters quietly admired by villagers, who saw in the gang's defiance a reflection of their own resentment toward distant landlords and an uncaring crown. It was this growing notoriety and the mounting toll of robbery and violence along the roads that would soon force the attention of the authorities themselves, setting in motion an investigation that would take years to bear fruit. As the gang's activities continued month after month, a pattern of documented crimes began to accumulate in local records, court depositions, and the anxious correspondence of merchants who had survived to write of their ordeals. And it is from these fragments that we can reconstruct several of the most notorious robberies attributed to the Oxfordshire highwaymen. The robbery of Nicholas Fenwick, described earlier, set the pattern that would repeat itself with variations over the following seasons. Fenwick was a moderately prosperous cloth merchant from a market town, a man who had built his trade over more than a decade of careful dealing, traveling the Western Road perhaps a dozen times a year to sell finished wool cloth at distant fairs. On the day of the attack, he traveled with 2 hired servants in a single cart, a level of protection that was typical for a merchant of his means, but woefully inadequate against a coordinated gang. The ambush occurred at a bend where the road narrowed between dense woodland, a location that local tradition still associates with the gang's operations. Witnesses were scarce, since the attack occurred in an isolated stretch with no nearby dwellings, but Fenwick himself survived to give testimony to the local justice of the peace, describing masked or partially disguised men who moved with obvious coordination, blocking both directions of the road before he had any chance to turn his cart around. The investigation that followed this early robbery was hampered by the same weaknesses that would plague authorities for years: a lack of physical evidence, no reliable description of the attackers' faces, and a total absence of witnesses beyond the victim and his servants, whose own fear and confusion made their accounts inconsistent in the retelling. Public reaction, however, was immediate and significant, as news of the attack spread through the network of merchants and traders who used the same roads, prompting many to delay journeys, hire additional guards at considerable expense, or seek alternate routes that added days to their travel. A second documented case involved a small party of pilgrims traveling toward a shrine. Further west, a group that included several elderly travelers and at least one traveling priest, individuals who by custom and by the general sentiment of the age were expected to be spared the worst violence even by hardened criminals. The gang's treatment of this group, according to surviving parish and court records, involved the seizure of what modest coin and provisions the pilgrims carried, along with rough treatment that left several members of the party injured, though notably the gang appears to have stopped, short of the lethal violence used against more heavily defended targets, a pattern that suggests a degree of calculation in how the gang chose to apply force, reserving the most extreme violence for situations where resistance was offered or where guards posed a genuine threat. This robbery, perhaps more than any other, shocked local communities, since the targeting of pilgrims and a priest struck many contemporaries as a violation not merely of law but of basic religious decency. And it is this incident that local records suggest first prompted formal petitions from nearby parishes to the county sheriff, demanding stronger action against the gang. A third and more dangerous episode involved the interception of a royal messenger, a rider carrying official correspondence between London and administrative offices in the West, traveling alone or with a single companion, in the belief that the king's business itself offered some measure of protection against common criminals. This assumption proved fatally wrong. The messenger was ambushed along a stretch of the same general road network. His mount was seized, and the documents he carried were taken, along with whatever coin he possessed for his journey. This robbery carried consequences far beyond the immediate loss, since interfering with royal correspondence was treated as a far more serious offense than robbing a private merchant, touching as it did upon the authority and dignity of the crown itself. It is this incident, more than any robbery of private merchants or pilgrims, that historians point to as the turning point that transformed the gang's activities from a regional nuisance into a matter of direct royal concern, ensuring that the response which followed would carry the full weight of Tudor state authority rather than merely the limited resources of a county sheriff. A fourth notable case, involving a noble traveler making his way toward his country estate with a modest retinue, further demonstrated the gang's willingness to target even those of elevated social standing, when the opportunity and reward seemed to justify the risk. Though details of this robbery are less fully documented than the others, surviving fragments suggest that the noble's guards offered more organized resistance than most merchant escorts, resulting in a violent confrontation that left at least one guard seriously wounded. An outcome that, combined with the earlier attack on the royal messenger, helped cement the gang's reputation as no longer merely opportunistic robbers, but a genuine threat to public order that demanded a coordinated and forceful response. Taken together, these documented crimes reveal a gang that operated with increasing confidence over time, expanding its range of targets from vulnerable merchants and pilgrims to messengers and nobility, a progression that speaks to both growing boldness and, perhaps, growing desperation as the gang sought larger rewards to sustain its operations and satisfy its members. By the time news of the attack on the royal messenger reached London, fear had spread across Oxfordshire and into neighboring counties, with merchants openly discussing the need for armed convoys, innkeepers reporting a marked decline in travelers willing to risk the western roads after dark, and local ballads and rumors beginning to circulate that inflated the gang's numbers and exploits well beyond what the surviving records actually support. A reminder that even in this early period, sensational crime had a way of growing larger with each retelling. It was against this backdrop of mounting public alarm and direct insult to royal authority that the machinery of Tudor law enforcement, slow and cumbersome as it was, finally began to move in earnest. The response fell primarily to the county sheriff, a royally appointed official responsible for maintaining order across the entirety of Oxfordshire, a task that had proven essentially impossible against a mobile, well-informed gang operating from hidden forest spaces. Working alongside the sheriff, and increasingly taking a leading role as the case grew in seriousness, was a royal constable dispatched specifically to address the crisis. An official empowered with somewhat greater authority and resources than the ordinary parish constables who had proven so ineffective in earlier stages of the gang's operations. The investigation that followed relied on several tools available to Tudor authorities, however limited these might seem by modern standards. Rewards were offered for information leading to the identification or capture of gang members, posted in market towns and announced at parish churches, a strategy that exploited the very network of local knowledge that had previously worked in the gang's favor, since the promise of coin could turn even a sympathetic villager into an informant if the sum offered was large enough and the risk of discovery seemed manageable. Road patrols were organized, though these remained limited by the small number of men available and the vast stretches of forest and open countryside that needed to be covered, meaning that patrols could offer only sporadic and unpredictable protection rather than the constant presence that might have genuinely deterred the gang. Authorities also began the painstaking work of tracking the gang through indirect means, questioning innkeepers and stable owners about suspicious purchases of horses or unusual movements of goods, monitoring known fences and dealers in the region for signs of stolen merchandise passing through their hands, and gradually building a picture of the based on the pattern of robbery locations plotted against the known roads and forest tracts of the county. It was ultimately mistakes made by the gang itself, as is so often the case in the history of organized crime, that provided the crucial breakthrough authorities needed. The robbery of the royal messenger, so bold in its defiance of crown authority, had brought a level of scrutiny and resources to the investigation that the gang's earlier, more modest crimes had never attracted, and this increased pressure appears to have strained the gang's carefully maintained network of secrecy. According to surviving court depositions, It was a falling out over the division of stolen goods, a dispute between gang members over their share of the proceeds from a particularly lucrative robbery that led one lower-ranking member to approach authorities with information in exchange for leniency, a betrayal that historians studying similar cases from this period note as a remarkably common cause of the collapse of criminal gangs whose internal loyalty, however fierce, rarely survived serious disputes over money. This informant's testimony provided authorities with crucial details previously unknown: the approximate location of the gang's forest hideouts, the identity of several key members, including confirmation of the roles played by Ashcombe and Reid, and perhaps most valuably, information about the fence, Old Marlow, whose trading connections had allowed the gang to convert stolen goods into usable wealth for years without detection. Armed with this intelligence, the Royal Constable coordinated a series of raids, timed to strike simultaneously at the gang's known hideouts and at the premises of their fence, in an effort to prevent word of the first arrest from allowing the remaining gang members to scatter beyond reach. Additional evidence gathered in the course of this final push included witness testimony from surviving victims, several of whom were brought forward to identify recovered stolen goods and, where possible, to describe the men who had robbed them, testimony from local villagers who had previously stayed silent out of fear or loyalty, but now came forward once it became clear the gang's power was genuinely broken, and physical evidence recovered from the raided hideouts themselves, including stolen cloth still bearing merchants' marks, weapons matching the descriptions given by victims, and coin that could be traced through the fence's own trading records back to specific robberies. The arrests that followed came in stages rather than a single decisive action, with lower-ranking gang members captured first in the initial raids, followed by intensive questioning that yielded further names and locations, a process that gradually tightened the net around the gang's leadership. Confessions, where they are documented in surviving records, appear to have come primarily from these lower-ranking members, men who had participated in specific robberies but held little personal loyalty to Ashcombe once faced with the prospect of execution, and their statements provided the detailed corroboration that authorities needed to build a case not merely against the men already in custody, but against the gang's leaders, who remained at large even as their network collapsed around them. The final capture of Henry Ashcombe himself, according to surviving accounts, came only after a tense standoff at one of the gang's remaining forest camps, where royal officers, guided by information extracted from earlier arrests, surrounded the hideout before dawn and forced a surrender after a brief but ultimately futile attempt at resistance, bringing to an end years of terror along the roads of Oxfordshire and setting the stage for the public reckoning that would follow in the courts. The trial of Henry Ashcombe, Thomas Reid, and the surviving members of their gang took place before the county assizes, the periodic court sessions at which the most serious criminal cases in Tudor England were heard, presided over by royal justices, traveling a fixed circuit, and assisted by local justices of the peace, who had followed the case since its earliest stages. The proceedings drew significant public attention, with accounts suggesting that crowds gathered outside the courthouse eager for a glimpse of the men whose names had become synonymous with fear along the western roads, a public fascination with crime and punishment that, in many ways, mirrors the enduring human appetite for true crime stories that continues into our own era. The evidence presented against the gang followed the pattern established during the investigation itself, beginning with the testimony of surviving victims who identified recovered goods and, in several cases, identified the accused men directly as their attackers, testimony that carried particular weight with the jury given the consistency of details across multiple, independent accounts. The confessions extracted from lower-ranking gang members during questioning were read into the record, providing the court with a detailed narrative of how specific robberies had been planned and executed, information that corroborated the physical evidence recovered during the raids, including stolen cloth bearing the marks of merchants like Nicholas Fenwick, weapons matching descriptions given by multiple victims, and financial records seized from the fence, Old Marlow, which traced the flow of stolen goods and money through his trading operations in damning detail. Marlow himself faced separate charges as a receiver of stolen property, a crime treated with considerable seriousness under Tudor law precisely because authorities recognized, as we have seen throughout this account, that fences like Marlow were essential to sustaining organized robbery. And his trading records, ironically, became some of the most valuable evidence against the very gang he had profited from for years. The question of corrupt officials, sometimes a feature of highway robbery cases from this period where local authorities turned a blind eye in exchange for a share of the proceeds, appears only faintly in the surviving record, with suggestions that at least one minor village official may have accepted payment to avoid reporting suspicious activity near one of the gang's forest camps, though the evidence on this point remains thinner than that assembled against the gang's core membership. and formal charges in this direction were never fully pursued. Sentencing under Tudor law reflected the severity with which robbery, and particularly robbery involving violence and the interception of royal correspondence, was treated by the criminal justice system of the period. Death by hanging was the standard punishment for highway robbery resulting in violence, and the surviving court records indicate that Henry Ashcombe and Thomas Reed, along with several of the more senior gang members directly implicated in the most serious crimes, including the attack on the royal messenger, were sentenced to execution, a punishment carried out publicly. As was standard practice, intended not merely to punish the condemned, but to serve as a visible deterrent to others who might consider a similar path. Lower-ranking members whose involvement was judged less central to the gang's most serious crimes, and particularly those whose testimony had assisted the investigation, in some cases received lesser sentences, reflecting the Tudor legal system's willingness, however inconsistently applied, to distinguish between the architects of a criminal enterprise and those who had participated under the sway of more dominant personalities. The fence, old. Marlowe faced his own separate sentence for receiving stolen goods, a punishment that, while serious, typically fell short of execution unless combined with other aggravating offenses, reflecting the legal distinction Tudor courts drew between those who committed violent robbery and those who merely profited from its proceeds afterward. The reaction of local communities to the trial and its outcome was, by most surviving accounts, one of considerable relief mixed with the lingering complexity of sentiment that had characterized public attitudes toward the gang throughout their years of operation. For merchants and travelers who had altered their routes, hired additional guards at ruinous expense, or simply avoided the western roads altogether out of fear, the executions represented a long-awaited restoration of safety and confidence in the king's highways. Yet, among some villagers, particularly in the poorer communities where the gang's informants and sympathizers had operated, there remained a more ambivalent reaction, a recognition that men like Ashcombe, whatever their crimes, had also represented a kind of defiance against a distant and often indifferent authority that offered little protection or support to struggling rural households, a tension between fear of the gang's violence and a grudging sympathy for their position outside the rigid hierarchy of Tudor society that historians studying popular attitudes toward crime in this period have noted as a recurring theme across many similar cases. The historical records that allow us to reconstruct this story, drawn from surviving court depositions, parish records, and the scattered correspondence of merchants and officials who lived through this period, are, it must be acknowledged, incomplete and sometimes contradictory, a limitation common to criminal cases from an era when record-keeping was inconsistent, and much of what survives does so only by chance, through documents that happen to be preserved in county archives or ecclesiastical collections, rather than through any systematic effort at historical documentation. Modern historians, examining cases of Tudor-era highway robbery, generally caution against accepting every detail of such stories as literal fact, noting that popular memory and local tradition often embellish the exploits of figures like Ashcombe over the generations that followed their capture, transforming what were, in reality, brutal and often squalid crimes into something approaching folk legend, complete with exaggerated numbers, invented acts of chivalry toward the poor, and a romanticized defiance of authority that likely bore only a loose resemblance to the actual motivations of men driven primarily by greed and the harsh economic realities of rural Tudor life. This tendency to romanticize highway robbery would, in the centuries that followed, become a recurring feature of English popular culture, reaching its fullest expression in the later legends surrounding figures from the 17th and 18th centuries. But the roots of this fascination can be traced back to exactly this kind of Tudor-era case, where the genuine terror experienced by merchants and pilgrims along isolated roads, gradually transformed through generations of retelling into something closer to adventure story than historical record. Why, then, does this story continue to be remembered and retold today, centuries after the events themselves took place? Part of the answer lies in what this case reveals about the broader conditions of Tudor England, a society caught between the growing power and ambition of a centralizing crown and the persistent realities of a countryside where law enforcement remained thin, underfunded, and often outmatched by determined and organized criminals. The story of the Oxfordshire highway robbers offers a window into the everyday dangers faced by ordinary people. Merchants trying to earn an honest living, pilgrims seeking spiritual comfort, messengers carrying out their duties, all of whom risked violence and death simply by traveling the roads that connected Tudor England's towns and cities. It also offers a case study in the mechanics of early law enforcement, the reliance on informants and rewards, the slow and often frustrated efforts of sheriffs and constables working with minimal resources against mobile and, well, organized criminals, and the eventual triumph, however imperfect and however long delayed, of investigation and prosecution over organized crime. The names of Henry Ashcombe, Thomas Reed, and their gang may not carry the same enduring fame as the highwayman legends of later centuries, but their story, pieced together from the fragmentary records that survive, offers a genuinely revealing glimpse into a period when the roads of England were far more dangerous than we might imagine, when a journey between market towns could end in robbery or death, and when the line between law and lawlessness in the English countryside remained far thinner than the grand palaces and royal courts of Tudor England might suggest. To summarize the figures at the heart of this story, the criminals were led by Henry Ashcombe, known as Black Hal, a former drover whose intimate knowledge of the Oxfordshire roads made him a formidable organizer of ambush and robbery, assisted by his second-in-command, Thomas Reed, a former soldier whose military discipline shaped the gang's tactics, supported by a core group of 8 to 12 additional gang members whose names survive only fragmentarily in the historical record, and sustained by their fence, Old Marlow, the receiver of stolen goods whose trading network allowed the gang's crimes to be converted into usable wealth. The victims of their crimes spanned the full range of travelers who depended on the Oxfordshire roads, merchants like Nicholas Fenwick, whose livelihoods depended on safe passage of goods, pilgrims, and a traveling priest whose modest means and religious purpose offered no protection against armed robbery, a royal messenger whose interception brought the full weight of crown authority down upon the gang, noble travelers whose wealth made them tempting, if riskier, targets, along with the farmers, caravan drivers, and local villagers who lived in the shadow of the gang's operations, some as victims, others as reluctant or willing accomplices in the network of information and support that sustained the gang's activities for years. Standing against them were the investigators, the county sheriff, whose limited resources proved unequal to the task in the gang's early years, the royal constable whose intervention following the attack on the royal messenger finally brought coordinated and effective pursuit, the justices of the peace who presided over the eventual trial, and the village officials and ordinary witnesses whose testimony, once fear of the gang's retaliation had finally been overcome, provided the evidence needed to secure convictions. The Oxfordshire highway robbers stand, in the end, as a reminder that behind the grand narratives of kings, queens, and religious upheaval that dominate our popular memory of Tudor England, there existed a parallel world of ordinary danger and desperate survival, where the roads themselves became battlegrounds, where organized crime flourished in the gaps left by an overstretched and underfunded system of law enforcement, and where the eventual triumph of justice, however delayed and however incomplete our record of it remains, offered a measure of relief to communities that had lived for years under the shadow of fear. Their story, reconstructed here from the surviving fragments of court records, parish accounts, and the enduring folk memory of the Oxfordshire countryside, remains a compelling window into a chapter of English history that too often goes untold, a chapter written not in the halls of royal palaces, but along the lonely, dangerous roads where ordinary travelers once feared for their lives.